They paid the fare to America, and there they melted in. Lovely Lady Liberty, with her book of recipes, and the finest one she's got. The Great American Melting Pot, to the Great American Melting Pot.
Ah, the good old days of Schoolhouse Rock. The song you just heard, called The Great American Melting Pot, written by Lynn Ahrens and Lori Lieberman, two famous Jewish-American composers, was pumped into my head as a kid almost every single morning before school. It played on the TVs of several million American children before their school day, and then was reiterated to all of us again and again, over and over throughout our entire time in American academia. But is it true? Was America really always founded as a melting pot of all different races and countless cultures? Was America truly founded and meant to be by our founding fathers to be a nation of immigrants from all over the world? As you can see, this phrase, melting pot, first started being used around 1908. The origination seems to come from a play written and performed by Israel Zangwill. Wikipedia describes this play as follows. The play depicts the life of a Russian-Jewish immigrant family, the Kishanos. David Kishano has survived a pogrom, which killed his mother and sister, and he wishes to forget this horrible event. He composes an American symphony, and wants to look forward to society free of ethnic divisions and hatred, rather than backward at his traumatic past. Now, the last time I checked, the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, and 1908, the year when the phrase melting pot first started to be used, was 132 years after that. But let's move on. How many times have you heard from your politician, your president, your standard Hollywood actor, and your local SJW that we are a nation of immigrants?
America is a nation of immigrants.
We are a nation of immigrants.
We are a nation of immigrants.
We're a nation of immigrants.
The next thing that follows this statement is usually some cringy cliche about the Statue of Liberty that's historically inaccurate, right?
And in the harbor is the Statue of Liberty, reminding us of who we are and where we came from.
See? Almost every single time. The Statue of Liberty, though, was a gift given to the U.S. from France to honor the centennial of American independence. The poem Upon It, which was written by Jewish writer Emma Lazarus, as you know, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, etc., 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 was a later add-on and cri de coeur by Lazarus about her major concern, which was the Russian pogroms against the Jews happening in Tsarist Russia at the time. Lazarus was asked in 1883 to contribute a manuscript to an effort by New York socialites to help raise money for the pedestal on which the statue was to be erected. She at first resisted, but then ultimately decided to take the opportunity to further her real concern, which was the Russian Jews and the pogroms that were happening at the time. E Pluribus Unum explicitly commemorates the union of 13 British colonies into one nation. The statue and the motto do not celebrate immigration. They salute the achievement of the settlers who founded those colonies and in time won independence from their mother country. The poem on the Statue of Liberty has absolutely nothing to do with people vying for America to accept more and more immigrants, but has everything to do with what Lazarus was actually going through at the time. Anything else that is taught to you is historically inaccurate and completely made up by pro-open borders advocacy groups. Now, what about the term a nation of immigrants? Surely this phrase has been around since the Statue of Liberty was built up at least, right? Wrong. As you can see, this phrase wasn't even used until it became popular in the 1960s. It was popularized after the ADL asked John F. Kennedy to write a book with the same title that became part of a series by the ADL called A One Nation Library.
I'm honored to receive this award from an organization which on its 50th anniversary should itself be receiving an honor for distinguished contribution to the enrichment of America's democratic legacy. Your tireless pursuit of equality of treatment for all Americans has made a lasting and substantial contribution to our democracy.
As you can see, this phrase was literally a pro-open borders marketing slogan created by the ADL. a Jewish organization with over 100 years of history in the U.S., whose current CEO called Donald Trump anti-Semitic for using the word globalist during one of his meetings.
It was sort of developed and originated in certain extremist circles populated by white supremacists. But make no mistake, where the term originates from is a reference to Jewish people. It is not a coincidence that the word globalist is used to refer to Jared Kushner and Gary Cohn and Steve Mnuchin, the most prominent Jewish members of Trump's team of advisors. It is really disturbing when the president or his advisors like Mick Mulvaney or others in the media literally parrot this term, which is rooted in prejudice. No, a president should not use the term globalist.
The ADL also gave JFK the award he talked about earlier in that clip after writing his book. Now, this phrase that you constantly hear in your schools, on TV, in movies, and from your politicians came into mass use only 60 years ago. This was also right around the time that America's immigration system was starting to be called racist. This, as you know, eventually led to the U.S. going from a healthy mix of mostly Western-style European immigrants in 1950 to a massive increase in immigration, which is now pretty much only coming from Mexico.
There was a feeling in Congress that that same notion of ending discrimination should also be applied to U.S. immigration policy. Up until 1965, U.S. immigration policy was heavily biased in favor of Europeans.
So what exactly changed? What law was passed that the American people had no say in? What act was signed that sent us millions of a type of immigrant that is over 3/4 on one or more welfare program, that tears down our statues demanding change in our country, that hoist no other flag but the flag of their homeland while advocating the government be overthrown, that say it's racist to be white, and that bring mob destruction to those who advocate for a secure border, less government, and the restoration as well as the protection of our Constitution? Well, in comes Emanuel Celler, one of the main creators and the driving hammer on the nail that is the Hart-Celler Act of 1965. Who is he? Well, his biography describes him as a Jewish-American congressman who died of pneumonia in 1981. It goes on to talk about his major role in pushing for the legislation that eventually was successful in changing what they called back then the unjust immigration policy of America, which even as recently as 1960 had strict caps of immigration coming from south of our border. Within his bio, he is quoted in saying, "Yes, I fought against the unjust restriction of immigration." But who is the face of this bill exactly? Who would be the one to get it through the Senate after Celler crafted it? Well, remember the guy who kicked off the slogan, "A Nation of Immigrants" for the ADL? Well, his flesh and blood and brother Ted Kennedy was tapped for this job. After the bill was signed into law, Ted Kennedy, the literal lady killer himself, trotted out on stage and promised the following about this bill. Out of deference to the critics, I want to comment on what the bill will not do. First, our cities will not be flooded with 1 million immigrants annually. Under the proposed bill, the present level of immigration remains exactly the same. Secondly, the ethnic mix of this country will not be upset. Contrary to the charges in some quarters, this bill will not inundate America with any immigrant from any one country or area, or the most populated and economically deprived nations of Africa and Asia. In the final analysis, the ethnic pattern of immigration under the proposed measure is not expected to change as sharply as the critics seem to think. Thirdly, the bill will not permit the entry of subversive persons, criminals, illiterates, or those with contagious diseases or serious mental illnesses. As I noted a moment ago, no immigrant visa will be issued to a person who is likely to become a public charge.
Zero on the food stamp and $4 in child support. That's what I got.
Yet the 50-year-old single mother who entered the U.S. by swimming across the Rio Grande has government-funded housing, medication, and $700 a month in Social Security.
Obviously, that entire statement was a complete 100% lie as we know today. But then, after he lied on stage, another Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, was trotted out on stage as well and promised the following about the bill. In fact, he says, the distribution of limited quota immigration can have no significant effect on the ethnic balance of the United States. Total quota immigration is now 156,782. Under the proposed bill, it would rise slightly to only 164,482. Obviously, this is way, way off. But before the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, our immigration and naturalization laws were a lot more similar to immigration acts that were outlined by the founders and forefathers of America. Nationality acts like the Naturalization Act of 1790, which stated that should any alien wish to become naturalized in America, they would first have to be a free white person of good moral character that has resided in the country for at least 2 years. This was specifically written in the bill. Throughout the years, of course, this was amended several times, including in 1795, where they even made it harder to become a naturalized citizen, extending the minimum of 2 years residing in the country to 5 years in the country. Then in 1798, making it at least 14 years, and allowing the children of naturalized citizens to obtain birthright citizenship. All of which still kept the free white person of good moral character statement in the first lines of the bills. This Immigration and Naturalization Law of 1798 stayed exactly the same all the way up until 5 years after the American Civil War, when it was changed again in 1870 to allow freed black slaves to become citizens of America. From 1870 to 1924, immigration and naturalization pretty much remained exactly the same. As America was growing and only had around 50 to 90 million people in population, infrastructure needed to be built, and thus immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Britain, and the Scandinavian countries started to flow in. Contrary to what you're taught in your schools, as you can see, slaves did not build this country, its infrastructure, its canals, its bridges, or its skyscrapers. The Irish and Italians mostly did. But I digress. This all changed in 1920 when President Warren G. Harding signed the Emergency Quota Act into law in 1921. According to the new law, annual immigration from any country cannot exceed 3% of the total number of U.S. immigrants from that same country, as recorded in the U.S. Census of 1910. Then, the Immigration Act of 1924 went even further, limiting total annual immigration to 165,000 and fixing quotas of immigrants from specific countries. For instance, the Act, which some know as the Johnson-Reed Act, completely banned immigration of Eastern European Jews. This was due to the recent Russian Revolution of 1917, which was started by Leon Trotsky, aka Leon Bronstein, and Vladimir Lenin, who were both Eastern European Jews. It was meant to keep subversives like them out of the country, along with anyone who followed the ideology of Karl Marx, who was also a European Jew. This act, of course, was only opposed by Emanuel Celler, who, as you know now, would change this all and immigration altogether as we know it later on. Imagine my shock. But before Celler got his subversive, disgusting hands on our immigration system, yet another immigration act would pass. This act passed in 1952. It's known as the McCarran-Walter Act. The law was hailed by supporters as a necessary step to preventing communist subversion in the United States, while opponents decried the legislation, of course, as being xenophobic and discriminatory. The act, opposed by Emanuel Celler, kept the quotas the same, and immigrants from Great Britain, Ireland, and Germany were allotted 2/3 of the total 154,000 spots available each year. However, the act did specifically remove previously established barriers that had acted to exclude immigrants from nations such as Japan and China. These countries were now assigned a very small portion of the annual quota. But still, as you can see, keeping our immigration coming mostly from First World Europe, where immigrants had an easier time of assimilation. It banned admission to anyone declared a subversive by the Attorney General, and indicated that members of Communist and Communist Front organizations were subject to deportation. I like that style. Now, what would have happened if no immigration happened at all? What would have happened if there was never an Ellis Island or any immigration acts at all after the founding and independence of our country? One demographic study concluded that had there been no immigration at all after 1790, the settlers' posterity alone, including African slaves and freemen's descendants, would have grown by 1990 to approximately half the size of the population in 1990. which implies roughly half of all Americans today still have roots in the founding stock whose existence the Nation of Immigrants creed denies. The federal structure that the Founding Fathers erected for the United States is firmly grounded in their British heritage and American experience. Now, those who signed the Declaration and the Constitution, of course, knew of Locke and Enlightenment philosophies, but they knew their native law best, the English common law. Common law remains the bedrock of every state's law today, with the unique exception of Louisiana. The rights of Englishmen were the animating spirit of the Bill of Rights, meant to secure them more effectively in America than they often were in England. So you see, America is a country of settlers and conquerors of Western culture. The America they had in mind was to remain Western. And regardless of what anyone tries to tell you on the TV, millions upon millions of Americans are neither immigrants nor descendants of immigrants, but rather descendants of the settlers who built and freed this country from Britain. Can you imagine what would happen if China was in our place, allowing millions of people to flow from south of their border into their country, who according to all studies are mostly on welfare? Could you imagine what the Chinese would say or do if then said immigrants were to say that their culture is racist, everything about them is racist, and that they must change to become more tolerant to the soft invaders? Yeah, me neither.